In the early days of professional wrestling, were a far cry from the glitz and glamour we associate with the sport today. It was a time when the lines between sport and spectacle were blurred, and the wrestling ring was much as a stage for drama than it was for athletic competition. In this rough and tumbled world, a select few women dared to step into the ring, challenging not just their opponents, but the very norms of society. Today, we turn our attention to one such pioneer, a woman, though not as widely remembered as the others, but she played a significant role in the formative years of women's professional wrestling. This is the story of Miss Frankie. To truly understand the significance of Miss Frankie's career, we need to first take a step back and look at the broader context of professional wrestling in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Now, we've talked about this in previous episodes, so just to paint the picture before we talk about this entire story of Miss Frankie. Now, this was an era when wrestling was still trying to find its identity. It was a time when the sport was largely confined to carnivals, circuses, and the traveling shows, where performers would entertain the crowds with feats of strength, agility, and cunning. These events were the entertainment epicenter of small towns and cities across America and in Europe. Audience flocked to see the strongmen and the contortionists and the pro wrestlers. Many were tough, seasoned fighters that were known as hookers or shooters, and these wrestlers would take in all comers. Now, often local men who believed they could take down the carnival strongmen for a cash prize. But these outcomes were sometimes real, more than often. These guys were kayfabe, but it ensured maximum entertainment. Now, many of her contemporaries in the early life of Miss Frankie, it's very shrouded in mystery, but the records of this period are very, very, very scarce, especially when it comes to women who participated in sports. Now, what I do know is that Miss Frankie emerged into the wrestling scene during a time when women were often relegated to the roles of spectators at best, performers that were more traditionally in feminine acts that were within the carnival circuit. But Miss Frankie was very different. She wasn't content to simply just stand by and watch. She had the courage and the necessity to step into that ring, a decision that would have required a great deal of determination and resilience. The exact circumstances of how she became a wrestler is very unclear, but like many women of her era, she was very drawn to the carnival circuit by the promise of steady work, chance to travel, and perhaps a desire to prove herself in a world that constantly underestimated the capabilities of women. The carnival circuit was a harsh and unforgiving world, especially for women. Wrestling was one of the major attractions, but it was far from the glamorous spectacle that we see today. The conditions were rough. Wrestlers performed in makeshift rings, often outdoors or under tents, in front of crowds that ranged from the curious to the outright hostile. For women like Miss Frankie, those challenges were even greater. Women's wrestlers were often seen as novelties, a sideshow act that was meant to shock and entertain rather than to be actually taken seriously. Promoters marketed these women as curiosities, playing up to supposed oddity of women engaging in such physicalities and demanding activities. Playing up the female wrestlers of her time was often billed as a lady wrestler. It was a term that was used to both highlight her gender and diminish the seriousness of her sport. In addition to these social, societal prejudices, Miss Frankie had to contend with the exploitative nature of the carnival business. Promoters held all the power during those times. They would decide who would wrestle, when would they wrestle, and for how much money. Female wrestlers were paid significantly less than their male counterparts, despite often being the main draw for the audiences. The physicality demanding nature of wrestling, coupled with the grueling travel schedule and poor living conditions, made the life of a carnival wrestler extremely difficult. But yet, Miss Frankie persevered, carving out a niche for herself in this challenging environment. She was a legitimate wrestler with skill and determination. The style of wrestling during this period was a mix of legitimate competition and worked matches and kayfabe events that would entertain the crowd. Miss Frankie, like her peers, had to be proficient in both. Now, in the ring, Miss Frankie was known for her grappling skills and her ability to hold her own against not only female opponents, but male opponents as well. Yes, you heard that right. She was hooking with the men too. She sometimes faced off against male wrestlers, but it was a rare and controversial occurrence at the time. These mixed gender matches were designed to be provocative and drawing the crowds eager to see the women take on a man in the wrestling ring. While these matches were often dismissed by critics as mere spectacles, they were an important part of Miss Frankie's career. It helped change the notion that women could not compete athletically with men. One of the key aspect style of her wrestling was her use of submission holds. These moves were either making you tap, snap, or nap. These holds required a great deal of strength and technical skill, but both Miss Frankie possessed in abundance. Her matches, whether against women or men, were not just about entertainment. They were about proving that she could stand toe-to-toe with anybody in this ring. So, what is Miss Frankie's legacy? To understand her impact, we have to consider a broader context of what women's wrestling was during this time. Women like Miss Frankie were pioneers. They were entering the world that was not just unwelcoming, but outright hostile to the ideal of women competing in physical sports. Yet, by stepping into that ring, Miss Frankie and her contemporaries challenged the societal norms of this day and helped lay the groundwork for the future of women's wrestling. Miss Frankie's career, though is not as extensively documented as some of her male counterparts, it represents an important chapter of history of professional wrestling. She was a part of the first wave of women who dared to wrestle in public, paving the way for future generations of female wrestlers who would contribute and continue to fight for recognition and respect in this sport. Her matches, especially those against men, helped to challenge and slowly change the narrative surrounding the women in sports. While Miss Frankie may not be a household name today, her contributions to the early days of professional wrestling are completely undeniable. She was a trailblazer in an era when women were often pushed to the sidelines. Her unwillingness to stand down against men and her willingness to compete in a male-dominated field help slowly shift the public perceptions about women's capabilities in sports. In closing, the story of Miss Frankie is one that deserves to be remembered and celebrated. She was a pioneer in the truest sense of the word, a woman who defied expectations of her time to pursue a career in sport that was, and still in many ways, dominated by men. Her contributions to the early days of professional wrestling helped lay the foundation for the sport as we know it today. While she may not achieve the lasting fame as some of her peers, Miss Frankie's legacy is one of courage, strength, determination. She was a trailblazer in an era when women's participation in sports was still a novelty. And her story serves a reminder of the challenges and triumphs that is faced by the early pioneers of women's professional wrestling. So, next time you think about the history of professional wrestling, take a moment to remember Miss Frankie, a woman who, despite the odds, stepped into the ring and made her mark on a sport history. Her story is an important part of the narrative of women's wrestling, and is a story that deserves to be told. Until next time, friends.